Are you thinking of leaving corporate, but too afraid to make the move? Have you already escaped corporate, but are finding it hard to run your dream business? Are you wasting valuable time by attempting to figure challenges out on your own? We have created a podcast for corporate escapees running their own business. This is the Corporate Escapees Podcast by Build, Live, Give. We bring you first-hand experiences of guests going through many of the struggles you face each and every day as a corporate escapee. We get real with no corporate BS. And now, over to your host, Paul Higgins.
Hello and welcome to Corporate Escapees, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of people who are successfully running their own businesses, hearing their war stories and motivations for making the jump from their corporate gig. I'm your host, Paul Higgins, and our guest today is someone who does just an amazing job of giving so much information. He had a brilliant career in corporate, worked with some of the biggest brands, and then inspired by a family tragedy to go and create something that was absolutely new in the world. He left and became a startup. And now he runs a brilliant community helping other startups and other corporates to continually create things that are new in the world. So what I'll do is now hand you over to Steve Glaveski from Collective Campus. Welcome, Steve Glaveski from Collective Campus to the Corporate Escapee podcast brought to you by Build, Live, Give. So, Steve, we're going to get to know lots about you today, but why don't we start with something your family or friends would know about you that we wouldn't?
Well, Paul, that's a great question to kick off with, and immediately making me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And the answer to that question will probably be in my late teens and early 20s, I played in a glam rock band, which meant that I had to wear zebra print pants and a little touch of makeup as well. So there's something that won't show up on my LinkedIn profile.
So I think, is there much video or footage?
I think if you look really hard, you might be able to find one photo on the interwebs, but I won't point you in the right direction.
Great. Isn't it excellent that we didn't have Facebook and Instagram and all those social platforms back in the day? Excellent. And, as I said in the brief before we got to air, you've had an amazing corporate background. If I look at the brands and the companies that you worked for in Australia here, they've been quite amazing. So just tell us a little bit about your corporate story and how you decided to escape.
Yeah, sure. I have worked with quite a few big brands, like you mentioned, including the likes of Ernst & Young, KPMG, Macquarie Bank. And the backstory there was I more or less grew up in, the socio-economically challenged western suburbs of Melbourne. I went to public schools my entire life. I went to Victoria University, which is by no means a top university in the world. I think it doesn't even feature in the top 500. So I had to really hustle hard to get into those organizations. And ultimately that required me to get a master's degree before I would even be considered for an accounting role in government. And through government, I was able to then hop, skip, and jump my way into Ernst & Young, who originally rejected my graduate application after I got my master's in accounting degree. And long story short, once I was in the door at EY, that just opened the door to a lot of opportunity, because once I was in there, I just brought that hustle, that ability, not only ability, but that work ethic. And that opened the door to gigs with KPMG and, of course, Macquarie Bank, which was Australia's largest investment bank. Now, at the time, I was in my late 20s. And on one side, the learning curve was quite steep to begin with. But I found that after about 4 or 5 years, it started to taper off. And I did enjoy the work hard, play hard lifestyle that you found at big management consultancies like your EYs and KPMGs of the world. But what I found was after a while, I started to feel like, yes, I've got the 6-figure salary. Yes, we've got the business class flights. Yes, we've got the lavish corporate junkets. But deep down, I was feeling a little bit, shall we say, unfulfilled, or as I like to say, miserably comfortable. So I started asking questions and exploring where I go from there. And one thing I did observe while I was in the corporate world was a hell of a lot of vacant office space. So like every man, woman, and their dog, I decided I'd take a stab at building an Airbnb for X, which in this case was an Airbnb for office space. And this was going back about 7 years now. And this was while I was employed at Macquarie Bank up in Sydney. And because today the barriers to entry are so low for anybody wanting to start, particularly an online business, I was able to set up a prototype and get that into the hands of customers for a little more than $2,000. Now, when I set that prototype up, I said, okay, well, in order to get it into the hands of as many customers as possible, I need to get some marketing going. So the first thing I thought was press release. So I Googled how to write a press release. I found as many email addresses as I could from journalists' Twitter profiles, and I sent about 100 emails out. Now, of those 100 emails, how many do you think actually got back to me, Paul?
I don't think many, Steve.
Yeah, not many at all. Actually, one. And it just so happened to be The Australian, which, as you know, is a huge publication, nationwide circulation of about 400,000 copies. And that was enough to get the attention of some early stage investors. And my manager at the time tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, we saw you're in The Australian the other day. And so that raised a few question marks, but I basically said, look, it's just a little side project. However, those investors came back to me within a 3-month period and basically said, look, we want to invest in your business. And so it was a small seed round of about $150,000, but it was enough to give me the confidence, courage, and capital I needed to jump out of the corporate world. And long story short, the plan was to jump out for a year and see how I go. And 7 years later, and I haven't looked back.
Brilliant. Excellent. That's a great story. And you know, that business, because I must admit, I've had the idea for that business so many times when I used to go into the city. You know, what ended up happening with that business?
Sure. So building a marketplace business, I mean, nowadays I advise a lot of startups. I'm on the other side of the fence, and whenever I have a startup entrepreneur or a startup founder say they want to build a marketplace of some kind, I say, look, you realize that's about 10 times more difficult than building a single-sided marketplace, because you've got to align the value proposition for both sides of the party. The business model needs to come together for both sides, supply and demand. And in my case, I had no problems building out the supply side to about 12,000 spaces across Asia Pacific, and was getting some demand through the platform, but nowhere near enough to make this a sustainable going concern. But despite that, I mean, it was a 2-year trial by fire, very steep learning curve. And the biggest learning I got out of that process was not so much just the technical ins and outs of entrepreneurship, but more so that if you are really going to stay the course, because entrepreneurship is really difficult. And if you are going to stay the course, you really need to believe in what you're doing. And Hot Desk ultimately made me what I thought was what amounted to a glorified real estate agent. And that's not really what I wanted to be. And I felt that I could do so much more and bring so much more value to the world. And nowadays I do that by trying to unlock the potential of people to create more value, whether they're people within large companies or whether they're startup founders.
Great. And we'll go more into that in a moment. But did you find that it was easier or harder than you expected when you took that jump?
I think like a lot of first-time anythings, whether it's a first-time entrepreneur or a first-time kickboxer or whatever it is, I think you always go into it with a little bit of youthful naivety, and you are blinded by the bright lights of entrepreneurship. You're enamored by being your own boss and everything that comes with it. And you probably spend too much time in the first few months on things that don't really add any value. And I see this all the time today with entrepreneurs who conflate being busy with being effective by attending a lot of meetup events or spending their time on printing out beautiful watermark business cards and things to that effect. And I think after a while you realize that, okay, I've got this capital, the investment is starting to dwindle as I'm spending it, and there's not much money coming in. And that's when you start to ask questions. And it probably takes a good 6 months or so, in my case anyway, to make the realization that, okay, this isn't as easy as I thought, and requires not just an idea, but a lot of disciplined execution. And I think that's usually where most people come unstuck. They tend to think innovation, entrepreneurship, it's all about coming up with a great idea. But whatever idea you have, chances are there's 20, 30, 50, 80 people in the world working on the same idea. It's about who can actually execute.
Yeah, look, great insight. And, if you had to think of the 3 key things around execution that you've seen that would help someone listening right now, what would they be?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, firstly, define what your assumptions are that underpin your business idea being successful or not. So people will pay for it. What's the assumption around the customer segment, the distribution channel, the marketing channel, the revenue model, and so on. That's the first thing you want to do. Second, you want to determine how you can go about testing those assumptions. And that could be talking to people. It could be building some form of online low fidelity prototype. It could be running ads. And ultimately, once you've got the results from those assumptions, adapting as quickly as possible based on the numbers, based on the data. That way you bring your feedback loop right back down. So if you can be really fast at building, measuring, and learning, which is, to quote Eric Ries from the Lean Startup, then you will be in a position whereby you can find product market fit for your idea much faster than if you just do the same thing every day expecting different results, which I believe was Albert Einstein's definition of insanity.
Very true. All right, well, great. Well, the next is the build section. I know we briefly touched on it, but when people ask you, what do you do today, Steve? How do you answer that?
Sure. So today I'm a co-founder at Collective Campus, which is a corporate innovation and startup accelerator. We're based in Melbourne, but we have worked with over 50 big brands all around the world. And we've incubated close to 100 startups and helped them raise about $25 million in the past 4 years. And I mean, at our core, we are all about unlocking people's latent potential to create impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. Because as someone who for a number of years considered himself a frustrated entrepreneur, as someone who tried to challenge the status quo in the way of doing things within many large organizations who were not necessarily unwilling to change, but just weren't built to change. Being able to now go back into that environment where there is a lot more appetite for it, and being able to increase the capabilities of people to actually embody some of those entrepreneurial behaviors, to change, to shift the culture within large organizations, to partner the domain expertise, the assets, the capital of large organizations with the talent, tech, enthusiasm, and speed of young emerging startups so that they can take something new into the world. That gets me out of bed every morning.
Brilliant. And sort of who are your ideal clients? What sort of sectors, or are there any particular corporates that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, we like to say that what we teach and what we work with clients on is industry agnostic. So we've got clients from across, say, legal services, insurance services, banking, sports, entertainment, media, film, you name it. We've got clients across the gamut. We've worked with brands like BNP Paribas, Telstra, National Australia Bank, FWD Insurance in Hong Kong, just countless firms in the legal services industry, about 9 law firms across the world, including Clifford Chance, which is one of the big Magic Circle law firms. So I wouldn't say there is an ideal firm, but ultimately it comes back to what characterizes that organization, and are they in an industry that's fast changing and they find themselves slow to change? Because if the world is changing faster outside their 4 walls, then they're going to find themselves on the back foot very quickly. And then they should probably, they would benefit not only from working with firms like ours, but many of the other firms out there who are working in this space.
Yeah, great. And as far as entrepreneurs, what are some of the key traits or skills that you're looking for from entrepreneurs?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, entrepreneurs need to be very, very comfortable with ambiguity, particularly if they're taking products to market that are new, that have never been done before. That's absolutely critical. They need to be resilient. That, to me, is probably the number one skill an entrepreneur needs to have, because particularly in the early stages, you're going to hear no, 99 times for every one yes you hear, just like I did with my press release distribution. And, if you're uncomfortable with hearing no, then chances are you're not going to stay the course. You just need to make friends with no, make friends with discomfort. And if you can do that, then you're just going to open yourself up to so much more opportunity. And that's not just true of entrepreneurship. I think that's true of everything. I think people tend to shy away from some of life's most awesome experiences because they're scared of how it will make them feel, or that their ego will be hurt, or something to that effect. And, I went surfing with a client of mine in Bondi recently, and I can't surf to save myself. I mean, I live in the inner west of Melbourne, and the closest waves are a good hour drive away in Bells Beach. And, the feeling of getting out there with there's just heaps of surfers out there all catching these waves, and there's me going out there wiping out time after time after time. Of course, my ego was hurt, but afterwards, I still felt amazing and just got this rush. And I've since been back a couple more times and I've managed to catch a few waves, but I wouldn't have gotten to that point if I didn't want to embrace that discomfort to begin with. So that's a real big one.
Brilliant. And the third?
The third one is always be experimenting, really. I mean, that comes back to what I was saying earlier around, the things that entrepreneurs should do to determine that they're working on the right thing. Like always be experimenting. And it's not just about experimenting with your idea. It's experimenting with the sales strategies you're applying, the marketing channels you're exploring, features you're looking to roll out. Lots of different things. The worst thing that people can do, given that time is our most precious commodity, is to spend their time on the wrong things. As Peter Drucker said, nothing is worse than the wrong things done right. And we see this in the corporate world all the time, where it's all about efficiency. But oftentimes it's about efficiency at doing the wrong thing, or the thing that's not going to add as much value as something else. So always be experimenting and adapting as you go, particularly during the early stages of your business. And I'm talking the first 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, brilliant advice. And for you and Collective Campus, what will Collective Campus look like in 3 years' time? What's the vision for you and the business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we are big believers in productization, and we are starting to track that curve, if you will, by productizing a lot of what we do in terms of our training. That's starting to go online by way of online courses, webinars, but also in terms of our consulting. So the big thing for us is really our culture change pieces, where we go into organizations and look at their processes, systems, values, and try to basically bring them into the 21st century and into a place where they can actually start to embody these entrepreneurial behaviors, get faster at experimentation. And so what we're doing there is basically building a platform that not only captures ideas, there's a lot of platforms out there that capture ideas, but it's more about a platform that helps organizations engage in disciplined execution. We've already done this for schools, for schools that want to teach their kids entrepreneurship, with a platform we've called Lemonade Stand. But now we're looking at rolling something similar out for the corporate world. But Collective Campus has always been an evolutionary beast. I mean, we started out running classes for, B2C classes for people who are interested in, say, learning about digital marketing, and it's just constantly evolved. And we've been spinning off businesses. So we're a bit of a venture arm in the sense that we've recently spun off a blockchain-enabled share registry, which is looking to put shares on the blockchain. And that's something that my co-founder is really taking the lead on. It's called Concrete, and that's raised about $2 million in the last 3 months. And I guess that's the one thing that I find the most empowering about entrepreneurship, the fact that you do have the opportunity to, hey, this sounds like an emerging opportunity. Let's go after it. So while I can sit here and say, this is where I think we'll be in 3 years, given the pace at which we experiment and given how we try to manage our time and focus on the high value tasks, my answer right now, Paul, and what it is in 3 years could be very different.
Yeah, great. And what about both from the corporation and the entrepreneur side? How do you get the talent that you need to continue to grow?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I mean, for big corporates, it's simply not a matter of running a glorified idea challenge, as many do, or throwing some beanbags around the office and setting up a ping pong table and dressing like a startup on a Friday. So here's your gray hoodie, everybody dressed like Mark Zuckerberg. It's not that easy. I mean, if that stuff happens as part of a bigger program, that's great. But ultimately, if you want to attract good people, obviously you've got your extrinsic benefits, your pay and your bonuses and everything else. But really, I mean, for people like myself who did have all of that in the corporate world but was still miserably comfortable, you've got to really give them the opportunity to learn something, to get really good at something they have a passion for. You've got to give them some sense of autonomy and control over where that organization is going, as insofar as is reasonable, and also alignment with purpose. Because if you don't really give them that, people who are driven by purpose, people who are driven by more than just the bottom line, which is most entrepreneurs. I mean, yes, they want to make money, but also they want to create some value for the world. You're going to have a very difficult time of attracting them to the organization, and a very difficult time of, if you're lucky in attracting them there, keeping them. And so once they're there, you need to create an environment where they can actually take their ideas and experiment. and run with them, rather than have to play months and months of politics just to get $5,000 to build a low fidelity prototype, because nothing will suck the morale out of someone faster than politics at a big corporation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, remember that very well.
Well, you had was it 18 years at Coca-Cola?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so a lot of time spent on politics, unfortunately, both locally and globally. And as far as someone who's just left corporate, you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, I'd love to get into Collective Campus, or I'd love to get into something like Collective Campus. Now, what's the best way for them to go about it, Steve?
To get into an organization like ours, or just to start their own thing?
No, to get into an organization like yours.
Yeah, look, I think the best thing would be, well, there are numerous things they can do, but what's worked when people have tried to get into an organization like ours in the past is really demonstrating that they are a critical thinker, that they do know our organization, or that they also have done something in the startup space. It doesn't need to be successful. It could just be that they founded some sort of online store and they were selling some kind of, to quote accounting textbooks, widgets. And that was something that they built out, and they learned about marketing channels, and they learned about a few different things. I think what we look for is people who are proactive, people who are also curious. One thing I do when I'm reviewing someone's resume or application is I'll jump onto their social media profiles and I'll have a look at what kind of things do they actually follow. What are they interested in? I mean, if their Facebook wall is, covered in, some sort of reality TV show, social shares, then I'm probably not going to think they're the most curious people in the world. But if I see that they're following lots of hard driving entrepreneurs, if I see that they've got interests in different disciplines, be it neuroscience, be it technology, whatever it is, I'm probably going to be interested in a conversation, because entrepreneurs really need to be curious about the world. And it's not just the entrepreneurs, it's also the people that work for entrepreneurial organizations, because one thing you'll need to ensure as you're building your organization is values alignment between the people in your team. And that gets more difficult as the team gets bigger and bigger. So if you're bringing people into the fold who are all about taking orders, who are all about passing blame, not taking ownership, who are all about delaying a decision as much as possible, that's not going to fly in the entrepreneurial world. So you really need to be putting your best foot forward and showing me, or showing whoever, whichever organization you're applying for, that you have those attributes.
Brilliant. And you talked about team. How big's your team, and how do you get that values and culture firing?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, our core team is 8 people with 21 people around the world. So I'm a big believer in keeping the core team as lean as possible. And then as for our 21 people around the world, I mean, they come from a range of different backgrounds and help us across a range of different areas. And that could be everything from your virtual assistants through to designers, developers, as well as a number of facilitators and consultants that we have in different markets. And the second part of your question, sorry, Paul, that was how do we keep them engaged?
Yeah, how do you keep that great value and values and culture that you talked about?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, our values essentially were created by the team. So of the 8 people that are in our core team right now, 6 of them were involved in shaping the values. And that was an afternoon down at the Arbory in Melbourne. For those of you who aren't from Melbourne listening, that's just a little riverside bar. And that was on a Friday afternoon where we basically just recounted stories of the past 3 years. So we're 4 years in now. This was done about a year ago. Recounted stories, pulled out the ones that really stuck out to us, the ones that we're the most proud of. And that's how we landed on our mission, which was to unlock people's potential to create impact. And from there, we started honing in on what are the values, what's gotten us to the point that's gotten us here. And it really has been things like radical transparency. We don't wait 1 year for a performance review or anything to that effect. We're just open and tell each other what we think. Obviously, we're diligent about how we do that. If someone turns up to work wearing a jacket I don't quite like, I don't say that's a crappy jacket, take it home or anything like that. It's really about work-related feedback, because ultimately the faster they get the feedback, the better they will perform, the better the organization will perform, the faster they will grow. And it's all about tightening up those feedback loops. But apart from that, it has been really just supporting people's ideas, creating an environment where they can experiment. Our Lemonade Stand program, the children's entrepreneurship program that we run, that was really one of my employees had an idea. They said, hey, during December, January, how about we look at helping kids learn about entrepreneurial sort of methodologies and tools? And I could have said, that's a ridiculous idea. We work with corporates and startups. What did we know about working with 9-year-olds? And I didn't. I said, well, find a way to test that for under $100 and we'll review the results and go from there. So in that case, they literally just put together some a simple curriculum. They put together an Eventbrite event rather, and spent $100 on Facebook ads. And after $100, we got about 200 clicks with 20 conversions. We had a full class. And since then, we've put over 1,000 kids through that program. And so that's a great example whereby you give your people you empower them with the opportunity to experiment, because it does give them more ownership. And when people feel like they're a part of the journey, not just answering to someone else's sort of vision or responding to someone else's vision, I think they really buy in the long term. And it's really just about being human and treating them as human beings, and not just treating them as workers on the assembly line, because I think so many organizations still think that in order to motivate someone, it's all about money. And I think Dan Pink busted this myth in his book Drive, where he said, look, since we've evolved and moved on from purely algorithmic tasks in the early 20th century, we're now doing a lot of tasks that require people to think critically. And in order to do that, in order to motivate people to do that, yes, you do need those extrinsic rewards, but you'll get a lot more value out of people, and you'll get the right kind of people on the bus if you can give them those intrinsic rewards, which comes back to, mastery, autonomy, and purpose.
Brilliant. And before we go into the next section, which is the live section, I'd just like to mention our BLG tips to help corporate escapees, just like Steve, to rapidly grow their business. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Build, Live, Give. So, Steve, as I said, the next section is the live section. So tell us about some of the daily habits that help you to be successful.
Sure. So as I mentioned before we went on air, I was listening to your podcast on my morning run this morning. So I tried to get up not every single day, about 6 days a week for a morning workout, whether that's in the gym doing some form of high intensity workout, or whether that's going for a run, or it could just be a walk if I feel a little bit sore. But generally pumping the weights 4 to 5 times a week. Apart from that, cold showers in the morning, I think are fantastic, particularly in winter in Melbourne, because it's absolutely freezing. But apart from your physical benefits and mental benefits, I think emotionally, it just washes away a lot of the anxiety that many can feel early in the morning, I find, and just puts you in a really positive headspace, particularly if you've had that morning workout. But something about jumping into a cold shower, which every fiber in your body is telling you, I don't want to do this. Just let's not do this. But jumping in there and overcoming those voices, I think it's something about sharpening the sword and becoming more disciplined, because life, particularly entrepreneurship, anything worth doing is going to be hard. And you're going to have a lot of times when those little voices in your head are saying, let's not do this. And just by conquering those voices early in the morning, I think that sets you up for success during your day. And then apart from that, it's really just taking care of sleep. I get between 7 and 8 hours a night, try to eat as well as possible, which means not too many carbs, good fats, good proteins, and ultimately focusing on the things that matter. Like, I would rather do 2 to 3 key things a day in the office rather than 25 small things that I should probably be outsourcing or automating anyway. So I try to focus on the things that matter, because I can create value. And if I'm creating value with my work, then there is this positive feedback loop. I feel better at the end of the day. I feel more accomplished. I'm in a more positive frame of mind. And so that just becomes this sort of snowball over time.
Great. And the next section is the give section. So what's a cause or a community that you're passionate about, and why?
I'd say the Leukemia Foundation. So the backstory is I had a brother who passed away from leukemia at the age of 13, and he actually passed away about a month before I was born. So I never obviously met him, and I was just being told a lot of stories about him, and he was from what I understand, he embodied a lot of the similar character attributes as myself. He was up early in the morning, even as a young kid, working out before going to school, going for a bike ride, all that sort of stuff. And apparently he used to sit out on the front porch and just look out at the skies and say, one day I'm going to do something that no one's ever done before. And so a big part of my drive, I think, comes from him in some way, in the sense that I've got the opportunity to do what he didn't have, and I don't want to squander it by just doing some job that leaves me feeling miserable, or just going out and getting drunk every night. Like, I really want to do something that no one's ever done before and create some new value for the world. And, the leukemia, I think back then, this was going back to the 1983. And back then the survival rates were something like 10%. And with work that organizations like the Leukemia Foundation and others in the space have been doing over the past 3 decades, they've managed to bring the survival rate up to, at last time I checked, something like 80%. So that just speaks volumes about the kind of work that these organizations are doing to support research and to ensure that people like my brother who have these big dreams get to live them out.
Look, really inspiring. Absolutely love it. So the last section is the action section. I'm just going to ask you some quick questions and just get some rapid fire responses. So the first one is, what are your top 3 productivity tips?
Sure. So firstly, automate anything that can be automated. I use a tool called Zapier to do that, which basically leverages APIs between different tools. So you're not manually pulling your data out of a spreadsheet and putting it into your email tool or anything to that effect. So just automate anything that can be automated. Second, outsource anything that can't be automated. That's still rudimentary. So we use a lot of VAs for my podcast, for example. I just record it, and then I have someone over in the Ukraine who does all the sound production, will do the marketing for me and everything to that effect. So you should not be spending your time on $10 an hour tasks as an entrepreneur. You should be spending your time on $100 and above per hour tasks, if not $1,000 an hour tasks. Focus on your strengths. Anything that isn't aligned with your strengths that you're working on is basically compromising you and compromising the success of your business. So automate, outsource, and finally, P for prioritize. Always be prioritizing based on something I'm a big believer in, the 80-20 principle. I think it shows up everywhere. If you look at Melbourne's roads, 80% of the cars will be on 20% of the roads. And so this holds true with business. 80% of the revenue will come from 20% of the customers. 80% of your software use will be on 20% of the features and things to that effect. So what are the 20% of tasks, marketing features, sales strategies, you name it, that you can focus on to get the most value out of your day? Because productivity is about what you don't do. So tying into to prioritization is just saying no to almost everything. So say no and prioritize, automate, and outsource.
Brilliant. And as far as some apps or some software that you love to help you, in particular, automate, you mentioned Zapier, but what's some other stuff that you use every day to help you be productive?
Yeah, sure. One other tool I quite like, it's really simple, but I think it saves me at least an hour a day, which is a Google Chrome plugin called Compose Email. Now, you'll find, Paul, that oftentimes when people want to send an email, they'll go into their inbox and then they'll see a bunch of other emails that have since landed, and they'll click on one of these emails and they might click on another one. They'll start responding to these emails, and then 20 to 30 minutes later, they'll think, what was I doing again?
Yes.
And so this Compose plugin basically just opens the Compose window. So I can circumvent my inbox, I can send the email I need to send, and I can keep working. That's a massive one for me, because every time I check my email, if I jump in there every 1 hour, there's probably going to be another 20 emails. And one thing I try not to do, I don't care about inbox zero. Inbox zero to me just means you're really good at responding to other people's demands on your time. I need to focus on my time and doing those 2 to 3 things a day that are really going to move the needle. And there's another tool I like to use to help me get into what people call flow or deep work. And that's just brain.fm, which basically is white noise. So rather than listening to music, I'll put on Brain FM for maybe the first 30 minutes to 1 hour of my day. And that tends to simulate the neural pathways of flow, and basically helps you just focus in on what you're doing. And you'll find that when you do listen to that white noise, the rest of the world kind of fades away and you just get into this really intense place of just unperturbed focus.
Brilliant. Well, we'll put links to those and everything else that you've mentioned in the show notes. And as far as podcasts, I know you mentioned this podcast, which is great, but what are some other podcasts that you listen to and why?
Sure. I'm a bit of a Joe Rogan experience junkie, and I guess I enjoy that particular show because Joe basically interviews all sorts of people. I mean, he could be talking to a comedian one day, then a Nobel Prize winning astrophysicist the next. And he has this amazing ability to remember a lot of what his guests say, so that he has, as a byproduct of that, an ability to ask really good questions of people. And his conversations tend to be 2 to 3 hours long. So they get to go down really deep through all sorts of rabbit holes that normally we don't get to in our day-to-day conversations, even in a lot of podcasts like mine. I mean, mine normally goes for 45 minutes to an hour, but sometimes I wish they were just 2 to 3 hours long, because some of the people I get to speak with have just so much to share. And sometimes to really uncover, to get to the weeds of something, you really need to ask a lot and a lot of questions to uncover that sort of stuff. And that's what they do on the Joe Rogan show. And I think just being able to learn across a broad discipline of areas just means, as an entrepreneur, you can start to connect dots, because genius is really the ability to see. And the ability to see comes with collecting a lot of dots by learning about a lot of different things. And then you'll be able to start making these connections between different things, which may open the door to different opportunities.
Brilliant. And look, I think, you've just shared so much wisdom on this show today, but some parting words of advice from you.
Some parting words of advice, I guess, would be for corporate escapees in particular. Just don't compare yourself. If you're thinking about jumping, or if you have jumped in the past year or two, it's very easy to fall into the trap of comparing yourself to your former colleagues who are probably making more than you right now, living more comfortable lifestyles. But if all you ever do is compare yourself based on that one metric, then you're never going to give yourself the time you need to break through. Because if you do truly find something that gets you out of bed in the morning, you will get to a place where you are making as much, if not more, than what they were. And also, don't compare yourself to other entrepreneurs who may be doing better than you, because maybe they've been in the game for longer than you. Maybe they're in a different area. And yeah, look, if you are going to compare yourself, don't just compare yourself to who's ahead of you, but also who's behind you. And realize that while they may be better than you at one attribute, it doesn't mean that they're better than you at everything. I mean, Larry King is one of the world's most decorated interviewers. He's interviewed I think 6,000 or 7,000 people, but he's been married 8 times, 3 times to the same woman. So just because someone excels at one thing doesn't mean it makes them a complete person.
Yeah, very true. And I know people can find more about Collective Campus at collectivecampus.com. And I also know that you've got a fantastic book out. So where can people get hold of that and find out more about that?
Sure. So the Collective Campus website, just a slight correction there. It's collectivecampus.io. All good. And in terms of the book, so the book is called Employer to Entrepreneur, How to Earn Your Freedom and Do Work That Matters. And that comes out through Wiley on January the 9th, but that will be in bookstores all across Australia, DMX, airports, you name it. And will be available on Amazon for anybody anywhere else in the world.
Brilliant. And look, we'll make sure that we have this podcast out before then, so people can hear about that. But really loved having you on the show today, Steve. I think you're a brilliant example of someone following their dreams. And I know that was from I suppose for you an unfortunate situation with losing a brother at a very young age, but that's inspired you. And your whole story today has been very inspiring. And I think the work that you do in Collective Campus is brilliant. So thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure. And also thank you for taking your message to the world and inspiring lots of corporate escapees to make the jump.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers.
There was just so many brilliant points by Steve in this interview, but the top 3, if I had to come up with the top 3, first one is skills you need to be successful as an entrepreneur. I think Steve lists some brilliant skills there. So I really love that. The second was his productivity tips. So automate, outsource, and prioritize. I think, the way that he expressed those are so important. And then the last one was around that curiosity. So what he looks for to join an accelerator and the entrepreneurs that are going into his accelerator and just what he thinks around that curiosity. I think those were 3 key points that I got out of this. So I'd love to hear what you got out of this and the value that you got. You can email me at paul@buildlivegive.com. Also, I'd love you to share this podcast within your community, because I think, Steve adds so much value that I'm sure that your peers and your friends will get enormous value out of this. So please share it, and look forward to the next episode of Corporate Escapees.
Thank you for listening to the Corporate Escapees podcast, brought to you by the team at Build, Live, Give. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it with other corporate escapees. If you would like to join a community of like-minded peers, please visit www.buildlivegive.com. Until next time, thanks for listening and be brave.